Right, we're on air. Okay, so my name is Jim Horden. I'm from the Journal of Vocational Education and Training Editorial Management Committee. And we have with us here today Professor Philipp Gonon and Professor Thomas Deissinger. And they are very kindly agreed to guest edit a special issue on the history of vocational education and training for JVET. So we're going to ask them a few questions about the special issue. And the first one that I have is, oh, let's find it. Where did the idea for the special issue come from?
Let me start, if you like. My name is Philipp Gonon, as I was introduced, from the University of Zurich. History of vocational education and training is a topic which is not so prominent today. Nevertheless, I think it is a very important perspective to look at VET, vocational education and training systems, through a historical lens. I think we could explain a lot of developments and perhaps also how does a system evolve and which could be the future of such a system. And in this sense, a historical perspective is, I think, quite important.
Yes, I can just underline what Philipp said. It's a very important issue. We have very few researchers in our community in the German-speaking countries, even in the German-speaking countries where the history of VET has a certain tradition. But we certainly need more young researchers to do this. So we just came together. It was actually Philipp's idea, much more than my idea. And I joined in. And I think it's really very important that we have this very, very remarkable volume now. If you look at the contents, it's quite remarkable. Yeah.
Yes, I heard you certainly had quite a lot of interest in terms of abstracts submitted and sort of expressions of interest in the special issue. But just before we get on to that, I wanted to just ask you, why do you think that so few people are engaging with the history of vocational education and training? Is this something which is characteristic of the way that educational research is developing, would you say? Is there a particular reason why that's so?
Yes, I would say it's a question of the circumstances of the times. Today, more rewarding topical research, quantitative research which is working more in a social science modus is perhaps more rewarding for young researchers. And also, there is not so much awareness that perhaps a historical view is also important and could help to explain phenomena today. So I would say there is, that is not just for vocational education and training, but more in general in science and in history. It's a hard work for historians to show that they are important, that a historical view is necessary, and this has been a bit lost. In the 70s and 80s, this was different. I think also regarding the perhaps Marxist or socialist perspectives, more the perspectives which included an evolutionist approach. This was more important in these times, and nowadays it's more or less, things are changing so quickly, so people have difficulties to understand or to value the way to work with a historical approach.
Yes, I also think that it's a general problem for educational research, not just for VET research, that we have few people working in this field. I mean, the international topic range is dominated by OECD and ZVET. Well, there's a lot of work going on there, but not in the traditional VET research community, which we both of us represent actually with our university institutes with our courses. So this is a bit a pity, actually. I just can agree to what Philipp said. It's a methodological and content issue, I think, when you look at young researchers. Yeah.
Which makes your special issue all the more important as it brings together, I think, a real focus back on this area of work. So would you like to just say a little bit about the papers in general, overall as a set or individually? Could you give us a bit of an overview of the content that you have agreed to publish in the special issue?
Thomas, would you like to start? I can also join in after.
Sorry, my microphone. Yes, I mean, we have quite an interesting mix of different topics. It's not a topic range which is one-sided in a way. So it's not just about the historical development in a specific country perspective, in an overall perspective or overall research approach. We have very specific topics, for example, the topic about the shoe industry. That's a very focused contribution. We have a contribution from Spain about the Spanish vet system, and as I understand this article, it's closer to the present time than to history, so it's a more contemporary history topic. We have different continents in our range of papers: South Africa, Australia, Europe, of course. We have this special focus on Germany and Switzerland, where you normally would expect this is all very similar because the dual system dominates in both countries. But the historical development shows that there are common features, but also differences. We have also an interesting contribution from the UK, from Linda Clark, Christopher Winch, comparative vet European research about changes in the last couple of decades. So it's a wide range and a wide perspective, and that's quite interesting and rewarding, I think.
I would add some aspects. One is that if we look at these different papers, we see that the understanding what is exactly vocational education and training is quite a broad term, and there are specific nation-specific kinds of dealing with these VET systems. The Swedish contribution, women's vocational education, is focusing on women education, and what does this mean related to vocational education, and what happened in a longer period with this. And I think this is one of the interesting aspects of this special issue, that we have a broad also historical focus. We can see that there are two phases of vocational education and training. One is at the beginning of the 20th century, and the other one is from the 60s on, more or less. If you see the developments regarding Chile, but also European research, also Spanish vocational education, and the expansion in Australia, you can see that from the 60s on, there was some kind of a specific focus on vocational education, and you had a very similar focus at the beginning of the 20th century with Kerstensteiner in Germany, with the Swiss kind of trying to develop a vocational education and training system. So the nation-specific aspect is quite important, and this is quite visible if you have this overview of this program, and you see that in different parts of the world, very similar in a way, similar talks and discussions took place, but on the other hand, there were nation-specific also solutions.
Thank you very much for that overview. In my sort of brief look at some of the papers, some of the things that stood out to me were the political context, which I think really came through in Chile and also in South Africa. Obviously, economics and the way that the economy changes is always going to be a factor with VET as occupations change, technology changes. But you also highlight culture as well in your paper. Would you like to say a bit more about politics, culture, and economics and their relative significance in terms of historical change in VET?
Maybe I can just say something to this topic. Yes, culture, especially in our paper about Switzerland and Germany, is a very relevant factor because it brings us very close to the educational component in the development of the VET systems, different VET systems. And I think the way different countries dealt with the educational content, the educational quality of vocational education and training is one of the most interesting comparative factors or criteria. And we can see that these cultural things, because it's not just the educational theory behind these developments, but also how this understanding of vocational education was located in the political system and in the economic system. And here we see that industrialization, for example, if you compare Germany and England, that's quite remarkable. It's a very, very important factor because England was the first nation to industrialize. Germany was a late industrializer, and the political systems of the two countries were quite different. And this brings us to the issue, how did this affect the educational quality which we attribute to vocational education and training, especially when it comes to company-based vocational education and training?
Yes, I would underline what Thomas was telling now. And perhaps just one element would be that in every country there are, so to say, political, economical, technological, and also educational concerns. And this is more or less some kind of a dispositive. In each country, specific legitimations, specific arguments were stressed a bit more than in others. And so I think one of the strengths of this special issue is also to show that it's not at all just the economy which is driving the VET reforms, but more or less, as you said, Jim, also the political concerns and also the idea to include more young people in education. And all these elements were an important element in different countries.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that really stood out across the papers, that we need to look beyond some of the sometimes dominant economic explanations for change in VET systems. Just coming to some further questions here. It slightly relates to the previous question, but I wondered if you might want to say anything more about this. Do we see similar theories, structures, and systems of VET in different countries in different time periods? In other words, is there, if you like, a kind of sort of global circulation of ideas in VET, in the sense that sort of the similar kind of themes and notions and ways of organizing VET or educational ideals kind of appear in different countries in different time periods, and perhaps get changed and adapted for the national systems in some way?
Yes, I would underline your question and even your suggestive approach. I would say, yes, it is like this. Certain ideas are circulating, and this is perhaps not shown in these papers, but from our research, Thomas and me, we know that the comparative approach is a very important one, and and a lot of researchers, they inform themselves what happens in other countries, or politicians, in a historical sense. Georg Kerschensteiner, the German, reformer, but also Michael Sadler in England. They communicated very closely. They wrote letters. They visited. Sadler was in Munich and tried to analyze what happens with these continuation schools in Germany, which were the model for some of his proposals in England, which were not successful, but nevertheless, which so ideas circulate. And I would say exactly the apprenticeship model, so to say, is a model which has been also nowadays very prominent and very important. A lot of people seem to refer to this model, although it is not the only solution how to organize vocational education and training. But nevertheless, the apprenticeship model seems to be some kind of an ideal approach of how to link the world of education and the world of work.
Yes, I think the issue you touched, Jim, about similar theories is a very interesting one, because it maybe helps us to understand how functional with respect to employment, to the economy, we think about vocational education and training. And if you look at different countries in Europe, let's just look at the three biggest countries, England, France, Germany. We see that this aspect has been treated in a very different way in the course of history. And especially the question, if education can compensate for this functionality, which we normally have in Anglo-Saxon countries nowadays with the competence approach, how can the educational issue compensate for this functionality? Because vocational education and training is primarily, at least in our view, a pedagogical topic and not an economic topic. And in France, once again, we have a different understanding of education than in Germany, for example. Yeah. And then the state comes in, the cultural issue comes in again. So it's very complex to look at these historical developments. And we still miss in our community country studies that look at the overall history of the various systems, Spain, Italy, France. We don't have a lot at the moment. We have some contemporary contributions, but not so much historical ones.
Thank you very much for those responses. So I wanted to just move on to another question now and ask you, what can current policy and practice in VET learn from historical studies of VET? So, I mean, we might assume that the special issue, in terms of its focus on history, has enormous value in itself in kind of unpacking some of the histories of VET. But are there also some things here that can be learned in terms of the contemporary issues facing VET policy and VET practice?
Yes, I would say yes. Policymakers can learn something from history. And one important thing is what is perhaps always said about Maggie Thatcher and others. Tina, there is no alternative. And I would say, yes, there are alternatives. If you look in a historical matter, you see there is always the possibility to change, things are not as stable as they seem to be. And it is possible to at least some kind of gradual change, to change slowly and to change in a way more profoundly things, if people are aware that there is some kind of possibility to change things. And I would say this is one lesson. And the other thing, that things are not as stable as they are. If you look at the contribution from Sweden, they also describe some kind of decline of women vocational education, although the Australian contribution from Erica Smith is showing that the apprenticeship system is not as stable as it is. And so to be aware that, that vocational education is also very much linked to the educational system itself. I think that policymakers should not just look at their own field, but to have a broader view. I think also this is a lesson which you can take off the historical perspective.
Yes, I can. I can just underline what Philipp said. I think I don't need to add too much to that. That's a very important issue, very important point. Yeah.
Good. So we can encourage policymakers across the world to have a look at the special issue and consider some of the different ways in which VET can be conceptualized or has been conceptualized in the past, and how it has been shaped by some of these different factors. Great. So I've just really got one final question I wanted to ask you, and that was, what should be the next steps for VET research in this field? So in terms of the sort of historical studies of VET, study the history of VET, what should be the next steps, do you think, for research?
I would say that we need these country studies, which I just mentioned. We have too few comprehensive research approaches to the issue of the history of vocational education and training. But besides, it's very important just to look at specific aspects, both to local contexts, to branches, or to special levels of research. For example, looking at theories, looking at background factors, looking at the political system, and so on. So the whole area of historical vocational research contains a lot of different aspects, different criteria to do research. But I think this comprehensive look at the major countries in Europe, that would be a very important issue. Yeah. So we need more studies there in this respect. But it's a challenge, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree with Thomas. This is very important to have more studies. Hopefully, this issue could help to encourage other researchers to try to develop an own perspective on their own countries or on a specific phenomenon. We should perhaps also stress that in this special issue, we have a specific focus on a macro level and on a system level. And in the proposal, there were often also some historical approaches related to concepts and to some kind of teaching and learning concepts, and these elements are now missing in this issue. And for sure, the issue is quite specific and focused, and I think this is a good thing. But you could do research in a lot of other researches in a historical way, and most of us, of the VET researchers, are not by training historians. So I would also suggest that be courageous, try to develop some skills in history, I think it is, in a way, it is rewarding at the end.
Thank you for those thoughts for further work. And I mean, we could also suggest perhaps that some engagement with historians who work in other fields of education could also be beneficial, perhaps, in terms of looking at different ways of approaching some of the VET issues. So thank you very much for introducing us to the special issue, Philipp and Thomas. It's very kind of you. And thank you for editing the special, and thank you to all those who are contributing to it, because it's going to be of great interest, I know, to a lot of the JVET readership, and we hope widely across the sort of policy community concerned with VET, policy and practice community interested in VET. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to edit this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.